Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive video review of a lens that I've personally been waiting on for a while. Ever since Sigma released their excellent 85mm F1.4 DN lens 2.5 years or so ago, I have been bugging my Sigma contact to see a 50mm F1.4 art, or maybe even possibly a 50mm F1.2 art. Well, the lens has finally arrived, and it is an F1.4 rather than an F1.2, and Sigma probably wisely elected to go with the slightly smaller maximum aperture of F1.4, which allowed them to control the size, the cost, and the performance of the lens, and to deliver to us a really high-performing lens. This lens comes for Sony E-mount and Leica L. I've reviewed it on Sony E-mount. This lens, compared to the previous generation HSM lens for DSLRs, it is more compact, it has more features, it has much better autofocus, which we'll detail in just a moment, and it has superior optical performance, all for a similar price point of $850 US. That makes this a tremendous value and a very attractive option if you have been looking for a high-performing normal lens for either portrait, wedding, or general photography use. We're going to dive into it deeply today in terms of all aspects of performance right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So this is definitely a lens that is highly improved when it comes to the overall build and performance. Not to say that the previous generation lens wasn't a nicely built lens, it was, but this was before Sigma had really implemented things like weather sealing. This new lens is thoroughly weather sealed, starting at a gasket at the lens mount, internal seals, and then we have something similar to a fluorine coating on the front element that is oil and water resistant and helps it to be easier to keep clean. Not only that, they have managed to add features and diminish the size at the same time. This new lens is about 235 grams lighter. That's nearly 9 ounces than the original 50mm F1.4 art. It weighs in at 660 grams. That's 23.3 ounces. The overall size is 78.2 millimeters in diameter, and that gives us a 72 millimeter front filter thread. Now the lens is 111.5 millimeters in length, or 3.1 inches in diameter by 4.4 inches in length. And so we have a lens that, while that size reduction isn't nearly as dramatic as what we saw going from the 85mm HSM art to the new DN art, neither was the original 50mm art nearly as large as the 85mm. And so this lens is certainly compact relative to the other, though I will note that something like the Samyang AF 50mm F1.4 Mark II is actually a still lighter and more compact still. But still, this is a very manageable size and weight, and I don't think it's going to be an issue really for anyone at this point. Sigma has continued to pack more features into their Art Series lenses here that have been released in the new DN form, and that is also represented here. We have, for example, their multi-tiered approach to aperture, where you have an aperture ring that can either be clicked with 1/3 stop detents or declicked. It also has a locking mechanism where you can lock it either in a manual or in an automatic mode to make sure that there are no inadvertent bumps of an aperture ring, something that some people fear doing if they don't really want to use the aperture ring. Sigma gives the ability to completely control that. We have also got an AF/MF switch here, and we have a focus hold button. Now I will note that when you're using the clickless aperture option for doing something like an aperture rack, that because this is, as everything in these particular lenses that are designed for mirrorless mounts, everything is by wire, and so it's all routed through the camera body. And so in this case, there is a little bit of a lag, I noticed, between the action in racking aperture and then the actual closing of the blades, and so you will see just a little bit of lag if you're looking at it in that way. Another thing you might have noticed is that there is a high blade count. There are 11 aperture blades here, similar to the 50mm F1.2 G Master lens, and that keeps a really nicely round circular shape in the aperture iris. A really nice performance thing that I certainly prefer. Beyond that, the lens, as far as the build, it has nice materials, a nice finish. It's a mix of metals and what they call thermal composites or engineered plastics, and so all nicely made. The included lens hood is definitely a step above your standard lens hood. It has it's more reinforced. It has a greater mix of materials, including some nice rubberized surface in the transition, and it does have a locking mechanism if that's something that's a priority to you. Sigma lenses also do come with a nicely padded nylon case, which is just that extra step of detail that I think shows some pride and craftsmanship that they have there. One final thing to note regarding the build and the features, that our minimum focus distance here is 45 centimeters. That's right under 18 inches, and it has a what I would call average 0.15 times magnification. That compares slightly negatively to the G Master, which has a 0.17 times magnification. Truth be told, though, neither figure is so much greater than the other that it's probably going to be a deal breaker for anyone. Up close performance is pretty good, and so that allows you to get some nice, near focus shots that with a very blurred out background. Now, one of the highlight features here to me is the fact that this is the second lens to receive Sigma's new HLA focus system. That stands for High Response Linear Actuator. And this is a high-speed, high-powered linear focus motor system that gives basically, as you can see here, pretty much instantaneous focus changes. And so unlike a lot of large aperture primes from the past where focus could be fairly small from one extreme to the other, focus is near instantaneous here. It is silent, it is accurate. I did a portrait session right in the midst of fairly heavy falling snow, and even though there were times I even got some shots where a big snowflake had actually obscured the eye, but what I found despite doing that and then also shooting through some branches and various things, that my focus accuracy at various focus distances for the portrait session was perfect. And when I zoomed in on a 50 megapixel body to a pixel level and looked at the images, they were all perfectly focused. So very, very high marks given for that. I also noted excellent animal IAF stickiness and sticking right on the eye. And so all good performance, my general purpose use, all of that, I had very good focus performance and really nothing to complain about on the focus front. Also, when I looked at it for video purposes, I found that the focus pulls were very smooth and confident. There was no pulsing, no settling, any of those distracting things that might take place. I also saw good performance when I did my hand test, where I blocked the eye to see how the lens would do in tracking back to locking onto the eye. It did that without any kind of distraction or hesitation. The only negative here that I will point out is that there is some significant amount of focus breathing that you probably picked up on there. And as a third-party lens, it is not eligible for Sony's focus breathing compensation that is in some of their newer camera bodies. And so, unfortunately, if you are a video, you're doing video and you need to do a lot of focus pulls, you will see some focus breathing. So it may not be a top-notch option for that. So just something to bear in mind there. Outside of that, however, autofocus is fantastic, and this is certainly a far cry closer to the performance of the G Master with its quad linear focus motors than what I have seen any other option compared to. So this is really fantastic in the autofocus department. So let's transition and talk about the actual performance when it comes to the image quality. If you look at the MTF charts, it shows that the new lens is as sharp in the corners as what the older HSM lens was in the center of the frame. And when I look at some other MTF charts, I see that it lags a little bit behind the G Master lens in the center of the frame. However, it is a little bit stronger in the mid frame and about the same in the corner performance. In other words, we have an exceptional optical instrument here. By the way, I will release a subsequent head-to-head comparison video between the Sigma and the Samyang AF 50mm F1.4 Mark II. Those two lenses are the most similar when it comes to price and kind of most similar in market position. And so I will give you, highs and lows, strengths and weaknesses when comparing those two lenses side by side. So stay tuned for that. But first of all, let's dive into our optical breakdown of performance here and take a deep dive into those optics.
Okay, so first of all, we can see, taking a look at vignette distortion with all corrections turned off, we can see that much like the 85mm F1.4, there is some serious both pincushion distortion and also vignette that is there behind the profile. So first of all, I'll give you a look at my just manual edits to show you what's actually needing to be corrected. And so if we dive in behind the scenes here and take a look, we will see this is what it looks like with a correction profile. Now, this is not available yet in Lightroom. It's one that I just got access to through Sigma in advance. And so you can see that it does the job just fine. And so corrections in camera will also be just fine. Now, if I turn off any kind of correction profile and I manually correct it myself, I'm dialing in a -8 for the distortion. That compares to, I believe, either a -11 or -13 that I had to dial in for the 85mm, so a little bit less pincushion distortion. Likewise, when it comes to the vignette, I'm dialing in a +84 and moving the midpoint all the way over. I had to max out that slider on the 85mm, so again, just a little bit less. And just to give you an idea with the G Master lens, the G Master I had to correct more in like the -5 area, and here about a +72. And so in both cases, a little bit more mild than what we see here, though as you can see, everything corrects just fine. The distortion is fairly linear, and so I had no problems with that. Now, depending on the time of year, you may or may not even want to mess with correction. For one thing, pincushion distortion does tend to be a little bit complementary to models or people in general. But in this kind of environment where I'm shooting in a very snowy environment, you can see that the vignette in particular is pretty obvious. Now, in this case with a person, I wouldn't say that the distortion is very obvious, but you can see that that correction profile does make for a more evenly lit end result. And, in vignette, you can always add to taste in post if you're in a situation where you don't necessarily want to correct it. Now, you can also see that there is a little bit of a longitudinal chromatic aberration, a little bit of fringing before, a little bit of fringing after the plane of focus, as we can see here. I noted that when I was looking at real-world objects, and so here were some very shiny areas on my wife's glasses. You can see a little bit of that green fringing there. Likewise, with this, just a lot of light pouring through something glass here, you can see in those transition areas that there's a little bit of a green fringing there. It's nothing that is particularly extreme, and obviously you can't even really see it unless you're looking at a high magnification level, but anyway, it is there. Now, what I didn't see is lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. So obviously we've got some really high transition areas here with, snowy branches and then against the transition to the sky. And in those high contrast areas near the edge of the frame, I'm not seeing any lateral chromatic aberrations. So no problem on that front. So let's take a look at our overall resolution and contrast here. Now, as per usual, I'm using the 50 megapixel sensor of the Sony Alpha 1, and I'm showing these results at a 200% magnification. So yes, that is a torture test. That's also the way that I do my reviews. You can see in this case, however, that the Sigma has nothing to fear. In the center of the frame, it is very sharp, very good contrast. You can see lots of detail there, even at f1.4. And as the MTF chart shows, things actually get a little bit better in the mid-frame, sharper still, which is really good in a portrait-oriented lens, as this is the rule of thirds area and a place where you're going to get a lot of composition. Likewise, we can see that even moving right down into the corners, detail here is really, really fantastic. This is a very sharp, very high contrast lens. So just for the fun of it, we'll throw in a couple of points of comparison, starting with the very expensive Sony 50mm f1.2 G Master. Now, if we compare both lenses wide open with the G Master at f1.2, we can see that the G Master is roughly comparable in the center of the frame, maybe even a hair higher contrast, even at f1.2. In this mid-frame, the Sigma is the sharper of the two. Down into the corners, I would say the G Master has just a little bit more contrast, though frankly they are very, very close. Now, if I stop the G Master down to f1.4, we can see that it now has a little bit more contrast in the center of the frame. It definitely shows that improvement. In the mid frame, I would still slightly favor the Sigma, but the two lenses are closer. Down into the corners, the contrast definitely slightly favors the G Master, where it is the stronger of the two. Now, much closer in price is the Samyang, and so here with both of them at 50mm f1.4, we see surprisingly that the Samyang is pretty intensely sharp in the center of the frame and is the winner here in terms of resolution and contrast. We move to the mid frame, however, definitely the picture reverses and the Sigma is by far the sharper of the two. And down into the corners, I still favor the Sigma there as well. And you can see that particularly as you get towards the edge of the frame. We're right at the end. Like here, the two are fairly close, though obviously we're seeing more detail on the Sigma. But as you pan over towards the very edge of the frame, the Sigma has a lot more detail, where the Samyang has started to really fall off the cliff there. So the Sigma was already excellent at f1.4, but if you stop it down to f2, we now see exceptional performance, probably similar to what we saw with the G Master at f1.4. Very, very sharp, very, very high contrast. The mid frame was already, pretty much perfect, but you can see that there is just a little bit more contrast there. It is intensely sharp now in that portion of the frame. And moving down into the edges, you can just see the texture, how much it pops in terms of contrast. Now this is basically a perfect performance right into the corners of the frame, even at 200% on a 50 megapixel sensor. You go from f2 to f2.8, and somehow the contrast gets better still, with a peak coming at f4, where you can see that our contrast is just superlative, even right here in the corner of the frame. And if we pop and look at a few other places, you can see that the detail just really looks fantastic. Everywhere that we look, very consistent centering, very, very strong performance all over the frame. It just looks really, really fantastic. So for some real world perspective, we can see f1.4 wide open versus f4. The lens is already very good at f1.4, but you can just see here that if we compare the two, it's just there's more contrast and detail rendered there at the f4 aperture. You can see in these vines just how much more contrast and pop there is to them. So the lens just really gets to exceptional levels. Pan up here and look into this tree. You can just see how the detail is just incredibly crisp when you stop down a little bit with this lens. Our minimum aperture is f16, but because of high resolution and diffraction, you can see that the image has softened a fair bit, though it's not terrible here. I would say you can shoot through f11 with pretty strong confidence. And yes, you are losing some relative to f1.4, but that's still lots of image quality there. And I would say it's still quite usable there even at f16, though I would prefer f11 to f16 in terms of performance. Now, we've already noted our maximum magnification level of 0.15 times. Here's just a closer look at the amount of detail that we are getting there. And while, at close focus here, we're not an entirely flat plane of focus, in the area where everything is in focus here, you can see very, very good detail and contrast there. And obviously, that's going to allow you to get nicely blurred out backgrounds, and we'll transition to taking a look at the bokeh. So you can see here that our detail and contrast is pretty intense here on these needles, evergreen needles, but you can see as we transition towards defocus, it's all handled really quite nicely. Here, even stop down to f4. It's a different type of shot because we've got a closer subject and a distant background. But you can see that the quality of the bokeh, even stop down that much, is really fairly good. Not a whole lot of additional outlining there, and so everything is handled nicely. And you can see that our detail here in the actual areas of focus is just fantastic, just really off the charts good. Now, as far as the geometry goes, you can see here at the wide open, we've got a little bit of a cat eye shape towards the edge of the frame. However, what we don't see is a lot of kind of double inner lining, something that Sigma worked to improve there. And you can see that if you stop down to f2, you can get a very circular shape all across the frame. So if you want the kind of shot where you have a lot of specular highlights and you want them consistently round, if you'll stop down to f2, you can get exactly what you're looking for. A couple of other bokeh type shots. Here you can see kind of a real world type example where Nala has moved close to the camera and my son holding her is just a little bit out of focus here. But you can see there's a pretty nice transition towards defocus there. In this shot here of an old Yashica, you can just see it's just my living room. So the various elements of the living room you can see are nicely blurred out. Overall, that's a pretty nice looking bokeh performance as well. Now, all of those things are obviously going to come together to make this a nice portrait lens. And while I don't think it's as magical as the 50mm F1.2 G Master, I do think this is a really, really lovely portrait lens. And as you can see, even wide open, there's plenty of detail there. Skin textures are nicely captured. But if we look towards the defocus area, everything is nice and soft. Another shot here, this was a little bit more of a distracting background. And so I wanted to see how the lens would handle it. But once again, we can see, number one, fantastic detail on my model's face. But then as we look towards the background, it's nicely blurred out. Here at a full-length portrait, the model is very tall. She's 6'2" or so. But you can see that detail is very, very nice, obviously, of the falling snow. This background is a little bit complicated, just bare branches. It could look really distracting. And while there is a little bit of green fringing there, as you can see, overall, there's no additional hard edges that have been added. And so the image still works, even though that background could be a little bit harsh. Overall, I was actually also impressed with the flare resistance, and so we can see here very, very intense morning sun, wide open. You can see that contrast is held up really well. Here stopped down to an aperture of f11. Number one, obviously contrast is fantastic, even with the sun right there in the frame. A small ghosting pattern that you can see here, but you can also see the 22 aperture, it's 11 aperture blades, so a 22 pointed sun star. A little bit of prismatic effect here, but nothing that's distracting, and you can see as I pan up with video into the sun that the overall effect, I think, is quite pleasing. This is a good performance for a wide aperture 50mm lens.
And so as you can see, this is a very strong lens optically, and while it does suffer with some similar weaknesses to the 85mm f1.4 DN when it comes to that pincushion distortion and vignette, at the same time, it's not as extreme as that, and it's also easily correctable when it comes to the standard profiles. I would say that in summation, the 50mm f1.4 or f1.2 G Master is still the most special 50mm option on the Sony platform right now. Something about that f1.2 maximum aperture allows for a little bit creamier, a little bit more special looking images, particularly in a portrait type venue. But at the same time, it is larger, it is heavier, and it is more than twice as expensive. I think that this new Sigma 50mm f1.4 DG DN Art Series lens is the best bang for the buck option at the 50mm focal length on the Sony or Leica L platform. It delivers very high performance. It gives you a really great feature set that compares pretty much straight across with the G Master lens. It has a build quality that's at a higher level than a lens like the Samyang, for example, and it gives us incredible autofocus performance along with, as you can see, a superior optical performance. At the end of the day, for a price point of $850 US, that's a lot of lens and a lot of performance for the money. And I suspect that there are a lot of people that can't afford the $2,000 for the G Master, but they might be willing to scrimp and save to come up with enough to get a lens like this 50mm f1.4 DN from Sigma. And that makes it a very welcome lens and certainly a winner in my book. If you want more information, you can look in the description down below where you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery there. There are buying links there, though just being populated, this being a very new lens, but if you'll check back for those, they will be available. There's also linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to get channel merchandise, and of course, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.